Merry Christmas, Happy Christmas, and a good holiday. Now the New Year is coming, so let me wish you also very good New Year. Now, I feel really a great pleasure to have with me and to who's going to speak to you, Kanak Dixit. All of you know about him. I don't think any of you don't know him and what he stands for and what he does. So he is going to talk about the mountains today and Mallory. Who knows? How do you think that he knows? I didn't know that he was the background about the mountains and all this. I know him as a journalist. I know he works in this and that and comes up with different things. But I never knew that he was so much interested and knew so much about the mountains. And he talked to me and he told me something and I found it was so interesting about Mallory and the mountain Pumori. So now he's going to talk not only about the two mountains, the mountain Pumori and Mallory, but I think he's also going to talk about Everest. So I really would like to welcome all of you here. It's a very cold day. I hope you feel warm inside, but I think everybody has a I like to see it maybe cold outside, but I think we all have warm hearts. So we should keep warm. So thank you for being here and welcome again. And here is Kanak.
Thank you, Didi. Thank you, Didi. Thank you, Ambika Didi. You're not only my Didi, but you're also my publisher with the Himal Media group of printed and online magazines. So thank you very much. And thank you all for being here. As Ambika Didi said, I am especially grateful here for the presence here of two people who have made it high up the mountain more than once. And that is Mr. Reinhold Messner and Khimlal Devkota. Reinhold Messner, of course, is a world legend, and I place him, sir, in the pantheon starting with Mallory. And I would perhaps mention Tenzing and Hillary and Doug Scott, and of course, it's going strong, Reinhold Messner. So it's a special privilege to be here in your presence. And Khimlal Devkota ji over at the back. Gautam bhani मैले फेरि Devkota bhani मेरो माइन्डमा Devkota अड्किया छ. Khimlal Gautam ji, I mentioned to you earlier and corrected in my article in Himal Media this morning. Khimlal Gautam ji climbed Everest twice to finalize the height of Everest and at one point stayed Mr. Messner on the summit for 2 hours doing his tabulations. So welcome Khimlal Gautam ji lai pani. Yeah. And as for the subject and the third presence in our room today, who may or may not have made it to the top, most likely not, in my own personal view, is George Lee Mallory, who Reinhold Messner has essentially anointed him as the spiritual father of high altitude mountaineering. And indeed, for him, yes, he does deserve applause, Mr. Mallory, gone all these years, lost on the summit in 1924. So, the person I miss dearly here, and you will understand especially why in today's context, is Miss Hawley, Elizabeth Hawley, who has had a particular role in my personal involvement in the Mallory story since 1975 in terms of my personal interest. That will become clear as we move on. Let's go. I have some slides and I will read off particularly some pithy quotes from George Lee Mallory, because he was a word craftsman besides being a mountain craftsman. And I believe that because the very first expedition to Everest in 1921 had such an evocative prose writer, who is also a poet actually, in that trip, that gave a momentum and a cultural energy to high altitude mountaineering to make it much more than a sport. And that's why I feel that this particular day is important, because we are very close to the end of 2021. And as Ambika Didi said, the reason to do it in a hurry before the end of 2021 is to be able to mark the centenary. Centenaries have been coming fast and furious. One of them, which we were all reminded of, not till another 2 years, but suddenly we got excited about the Nepal-India, British-India Treaty, the British-Nepal Treaty of 1923, which made Nepal sovereign in the modern era. And yet, in Nepal, the discussion is always about the 1950 treaty and the Sugauli Treaty, never about the 1923 treaty. So we were getting excited about a centenary 2 years hence and to mark it because we in Nepal get carried away by all kinds of populist propaganda and we don't look at where the reality is. So, among the treaties to highlight the 1923 treaties, among the mountaineers to highlight George Lee Mallory, and in particular his naming of Pumori, or let us put it another way, what I consider to be, my research has shown, his involvement in the naming of Pumori. I think we should move right away to the first slide. So, the context of the expedition of 1921 was the fact that you could not take the direct route from Calcutta up to the plains and up the Arun Valley or any of the other side valleys into Everest, because Nepal was a closed, quote-unquote, closed kingdom at that point. It was not closed for mercantilism, but it was closed geopolitically. As a result, you'll find it very interesting that Kathmandu Valley was quite connected to the rest of South Asia, culturally and economically, but not geopolitically. As a result, what did they have to do? They had to have the Great Indian Trigonometrical Survey had to base itself on that arc around the border of Nepal and have the theodolites all aimed on the mountains, which in those days of lesser haze, you could see clearly from deep in the Bihar plains, which on a clear day, on a very exceptional day, you can do even today. But then it was more general, so they were able to triangulate. And so you got here, that is the Kanchenjunga group, and this is what they call the Mahalangur Himal. And within Mahalangur Himal, that particular one, this one here, is Everest, Chomolungma, later Sagarmatha. So this is the triangulation looking over all of Nepal, which would be about here, right? And now let's go to the next map. Now it shows you from the other side. Nepal is all down here. So Nepal was truly in that sense forbidden. The map makers couldn't get in and the adventurers couldn't get in. So what do we have in this very first map of, geological map of the region north of Everest, which is around here, it doesn't show here, sorry, but this is around Everest. This is the Arun River. And the Arun River, we tend to think just goes north from East Nepal into Tibet. But it actually curves all the way to north of Kathmandu. And also it waters the north of Everest, including the Rongbuk Glacier. This is the Kathmandu area. This is the Rolwaling area. Kathmandu is down here. This is north of Kathmandu, Rolwaling, Everest. So this is the Arun River. This is the Everest area. This is Rolwaling. So they had to, what they had to do was go north from Sikkim, which is here, over the Jelepla into, they didn't go to Lhasa, of course. They turned left at Khampajong. And from Khampajong, they took a tributary of the Arun that goes westward to Tingri. And from Tingri, they came south. And these are the names that the Newar traders of Kathmandu Valley would know from the inside. In fact, as part of their daily, the lives that they lived in terms of the traverse from Kathmandu to Kuti and north of this whole mountain range towards Lhasa via Shigatse. Shigatse, of course, being a Newar name of 10 houses, Shigatse. And we write it today as Shigatse, or the Chinese write it as Xiatse. Next one. This is Miss Holly, and I have to pay my respects to her here before this audience, because as a neophyte journalist who started writing articles as I traveled around Nepal and thus became a journalist, writing about parts of Nepal for the Kathmandu audience in English and later in Nepali. I started out as a kind of a travel writer. And when I decided there's need for some research, I got interested in Everest and Mallory. So the place to go to, and a welcoming person, although she had a stern demeanor for the public, was our own Miss Holly. And Miss Holly told me, if you need to do research, Kanak, you have to go to the British Library and read up the books on Mallory, which I did. And what I came up with this column, Mallory of Everest. This was, the date is May 15, 1975. And I thought I was 20, but Shanta tells me I was 19, if that were the case. So I was 19 when I put together this article. And since then, Mallory has never left my spectrum of interests. And so one of the most excruciating and saddest episodes for me personally was in May 1999, when Mallory's body, after 75 years out there in the cold, exposed, freeze-dried essentially, was brought to light. The tweed, the embroidered handkerchief still in his pocket, his boots, hobnailed boots, the clothing that he wore, everything there, and his body sprawled. I haven't had the heart to bring that photograph before you, but it's seared in our memories in terms of how he would have fallen and what would have happened to him. But what I have to say today is between 1921, mostly 1921, and how it ended, I'm not going to get into, nor into the age-old debate of whether did he get to the top or not. Next. The reason we have to be grateful for Mallory's letters that make up the tome of the first discoveries around Everest and in literary form, which therefore gives that emotional and cultural energy to mountaineering, high altitude mountaineering, which I referred to earlier, is the lady, Ruth Mallory, who they had a family together, 3 children, the oldest of whom was Claire. And there was obviously not just great and deep affection between these two, but also an intellectual camaraderie that had them writing to each other in detail about everything that went the earlier day. From gardening to family disturbances, to neighborly matters, to great issues of the day of how to bring up your children. Mallory went into war before he got to Everest. He spent, I think, about 16 or 17 months in the battlefield, something we don't hear about enough. We know of how he was in the trenches, in the Western Front, how he suffered the poisonous gases, how he was injured, I think, by a bullet on his ankle and he had to be evacuated. Then he went back again into the front. So he was a soldier, an artillery man in the First World War. That itself would have made a story. We don't remember of that too much. Nor do we remember the fact that he was a scholar, a poet with very good prose, but he was not making money off it, and he was wondering how to survive. And he was expecting that the fame that he would get on Everest may help him in some of his crusades, as one of his writer friends have written to us, that he may then go on the lecture circuit, which he had already started going on. He already knew about lecture circuits. The time when he made that famous statement, because it's there, was to a New York Times correspondent in 1923 in New York, when he was on a tour of the US to raise money for the 1924, the last expedition. I should tell you, just before I get into too many years, there were 3 expeditions that Mallory went to on Everest. Before that, he climbed in the British Isles, in the Alps, and then to Everest. 1921, the one that I'm primarily concerned with here. 1922, when he then concentrated on the North Pole and doing the assault on the summit. And 1924, same route where he disappears until found in 1999. So these are 3 expeditions over all of 4 years. So with Ruth, the letters that he writes back to Ruth, obviously sent by runners and therefore arriving a month or late, more than a month later, nevertheless a very contemporaneous writings about his climb, the approach march, the discovery, the climb. He wrote to some other people as well, but mostly to Ruth. And that is from where we got the details of the expedition. So much to learn. Let's go to the next one. So the earlier I showed you the larger image, and this is again the map from the 1921 expedition. This is where they came up, having gone to Tingri and moved Khampajong over here, Sikkim down there, sorry, at the corner of the frame, up that way. This is not working. Okay, anyway, what's happening? Okay, this is the Rongbuk Glacier. The big stem comes up towards the North Col on this side. This is the East Rongbuk Glacier, which they actually did not discover in the beginning, which is why they spent time in this part, which is why we are privileged, and I'm privileged to make this presentation before you. Because had Mallory discovered this little gap, when they were coming up, they thought, what can there be behind this little gap here? But it turns out the East Rongbuk Glacier debouches, if that's the right term, into the main Rongbuk Glacier. What Mallory does is, he first comes up here and then comes up to the main Rongbuk stem this way towards the base of the North Col. This is Lola, that is right above the base camp under the west ridge of Everest. And then they go back and they come here in this way, and then this is the place that we are interested in today's presentation. He comes up and then finally comes up to this pass, whose name I have not been able to locate. Some of you may know Mr. Messner or Kim Lalji, but this is the peak between Lingtern and Pumori, right here. The pass is Lingtern Nup and Lingtern here, and then this is looking down into the base camp, the Everest Khumbu icefall. So this is the general terrain we're talking about. Next. So I told you how coming west from Khampajong, they came into the left fork of the Arun, which then leads towards Tingri. This is the terrain that he describes. Very desolate, very desert-like, compared to what he sees later and of course what he has seen earlier. Next. This is just to give you a non-photographic rendering. The colleague of Mallory, that's Norton, did this watercolor, and what you got is the top of Everest and the snow constantly blowing off the summit, which is a kind of a signature that we know of Everest, which is blocking the view of Lhotse. And I personally believe that the mountain, the little mountain to the right, which is of course further away in the horizon and hence lower, is Pumori. This one here. This is from Pangla. This is the pass, I think, towards Kharta. After having done their climbing here. Then they went to the other side. Now, I would now present to you the photograph of Pumori taken on the West Rongbuk Glacier, from the West Rongbuk Glacier towards Pumori, the mountain of our interest today. That's Pumori, and this is the tents, and this is looking west. When they go around the edge towards the left, over here, is when they go towards the pass that I talked to you about, where they look down onto the Everest base camp. But this is Pumori in her glory, because Pumori is certainly a lady. And I've got a close-up of this one. Pumori. Let me read up. This is essentially the core of my presentation today. So I'll have to read it out to you because it is a letter from Mallory. On 18 July, camped at the head of the West Rongbuk Glacier between Lingtren and Lingtrenuk, Mallory penned a letter to his wife Ruth, one of the many which make up a great written archive of his 3 forays to Everest. Mallory wrote on 18 July 1921, "At night, before we turned in, the moonlight scene," I'll repeat, "At night, before we turned in, the moonlit scene was half veiled in cloud. And in the early morning, the moon was still up and the peaks clearer. One mountain in particular, on the far side of the snow-covered glacier, was singularly lovely. I call it for the present Mount Clare, and I hope the name will stick." This was Mallory exactly a century and a few months ago, writing about Pumori. And here I write, the name did stick, but it was transmogrified into Pumori. Mallory was up on the West Rongbuk with a team of Sherpas, besides his climbing companion Guy Bullock. Phumo or Bhumo means daughter in Himalayan dialects and re-denotes a peak. It is believed that the Sherpas decided to adapt the christening into their own tongue, the daughter peak, and hence you have Pumori. And for me, the evocation of this from Mallory, his daughter back in Surrey with the family, Ruth and family, himself here, the moon is still up. It was obviously clear night with a moonlit night, and in the morning he writes this. So this says so much, but then there's so much more to say, which is why my presentation is only half over, if you will. I then realized after I spoke to Ambika Didi and we gave it the title Mallory and Pumori, I realized that this presentation will not be enough without Mallory and Everest and Pumori, because he had done us the favor, the world, of exploring the western regions of Mount Everest. And so what does he write about that? And why is it of interest to us here in Nepal in particular? Mallory never came to Nepal, but he is vital for us. Not only because he was one of the first trainers of the Sherpas and some of the other ethnicities of the climbing community, but mostly Sherpas who were coming up from Darjeeling, where they did the job of quote-unquote coolies. And much of the literature of Mallory also refers to the Sherpas as quote-unquote coolies. So when he comes up here, our interest here in Nepal is that he was looking down on Nepal and remarking in his notepad on the mountains that is south on Nepal. He saw to the south on Nepal. But let us not go too far for now. Let's just concentrate on what he saw on the Nepal side, because he was later to go to the east side, Kharta Valley, Kama Valley, and then up to the East Rongbuk Glacier from that direction. Not from the north, but from the east, which I will explain before it gets too confusing. But here he was in the west, and he looked down from, I believe he didn't get to Lola himself, but then this other pass between Pumori and Lingtren, he looks down, and there are 2 entries. Let me read both entries to you. And they are slightly repetitive. here is what Mallory wrote from the high pass looking across and over. Now this is the point. When I quote him, please understand why he writes across over. Because he was a craftsman of words. He knew what he was writing. We're not talking about mountains this way. He's already that high. And when he looks into the western Khumbu, he's looking across and over. So he writes, it was a clear dawn and the mountains were indescribably beautiful, wonderful. And the best of it was, I now saw the Khumbu, CWM. It is an amazing cirque, which is a synonym for the Khumbu. And he's talking about the western Khumbu. The great rocky peak south of Everest, and I will not show you the image. Oh, it's already there. All right, I was going to keep you in suspense, but here. This is the Khumbu. He is here, between Lingtren and Pumori, this pass, which means to come there, he has to come west Rongbuk and then up this branch. Sorry, this is moving a bit. So this is the pass from which he looks down. Earlier, if he had been to Lola, he would have seen a different view. But then I will read what he says from here, because the ridge, North Peak, Nuptse is North Peak, Lhotse is South Peak. This is the South Col, this is the Western Khumbu. This is the North Col, and this is the route that they come later to the north. So what he writes is, the great rocky peak south of Everest, Lhotse, is joined by a serrated ridge to the broken top of another huge crinkled mountain to the west, Nuptse. I mean, I have never read Nuptse described from that angle. Because Nuptse, as we know it, is a Nepali ma bandhari Phuche Himal. It's a tiny mountain compared to Lhotse and Everest. Yet, most of the tourism brochures show Everest, but it's Nuptse that looms. Because Nuptse is right over base camp and next to Kalapathar. So this is interesting that he calls it the crinkled mountain to the west and not of great importance. Whereas from the base camp, it looms. The west-facing slopes of Everest are a series of fierce rock ribs. And all the other sides of the Khumbu, which I saw, are fearsomely steep. Everest itself blocked out the sun, all the sun, and the Khumbu remained a cold, dark hollow behind the brightly lit snows. Our next plan is to force a way over our col and down to the Khumbu. So here what Mallory is saying is, later in the next paragraph I'll read to you, he says, oh, we can't go there, but that's Nepal. But then here he's saying the plan is to go down. So he says, we won't go down, but that's in a way, because we couldn't get there, good enough, fair enough, we'll move elsewhere, because we can't go there anyway, because that's Nepal. Here's the paragraph I'm referring to. We reached the col, and this is the col for sure between Pumori and Lingtren. We reached the col at 5 a.m., a fantastically beautiful scene. And we looked across the western Khumbu at last. Terribly cold and forbidding under the shadow of Everest. It was nearly an hour after sunrise that the sun hit the west peak. But another disappointment, it is a big drop, about 1,500 feet down to the glacier, and a hopeless precipice. However, we have seen this western glacier and are not sorry that we are not to go up it. Remember, this is where everybody till today is going up, right? But this shows you the danger of the Khumbu icefall and why Mallory himself was saying, Nepali ma hitkichaya bhancha ni, hitkichayako manche, but this is where we have been forced to go. Okay? However, we have seen this western glacier and are not sorry that we are not to go up it. It is terribly steep and broken. In any case, work on this side could only be carried out from a base in Nepal. And so we are done with the western side. It was not a likely chance that the gap between Everest and South Peak could be reached from the west. From what we have seen now, I do not fancy that it would be possible even could one get up the glacier. So what he's saying is, this is impossible. And even if you got over this broken ice fall, he doesn't think you can make it to the top, because what he has seen is this steep side. And he might have thought, and this is where the expert mountaineers who have themselves climbed this area would be able to say it, because I am a mountain fanatic without being a mountaineer, I think from where we are, and if this rendition is correct, and I think it is, from Lola, he would not see the South Col. This ridge comes in the way. So he wouldn't have seen the passage up the western Khumbu into South Col, which made it possible to climb from this area. This is the other part that touches me when I talk about Mallory, because we know that after the 30s and slowly Tibet closed down. Nepal opened up in 1949, and 50 you had Annapurna climbed by Herzog, Eric Shipton, Tillman, the works. They were all swarming over these mountains. Swarming is not the right word, but yes, they were all over these mountains. And so what he writes is this. From this point, please imagine, he's here, but he has also been some other places from where he can look across. So what he writes is, 19 July, we saw a lovely group of mountains away to the south in Nepal. I wonder what they are and whether anything is known about them. A simple enough sentence or two sentences, but it evokes a sense of history in me. That he is, as a mountaineer, he's seen what Tibet has to offer, and this is the southern edge of Tibet. There are not many mountains there, they're mostly the plateau, but he sees peaks and peaks and peaks. And so his mountaineer's desire and the explorer's desire is evoked at this point. And so I will now come towards the end. We are forced to consider that Everest was described to the world as the third pole by Mallory for the very first time. So what does he do? Even today, we are forced to consider Mallory's first ever description of Everest and its three main arêtes, the ridgelines, converging towards the top. And he writes, there is no spire at the top. I realized this suddenly. Yes, indeed. Mount Everest, the tallest, has to be regal. And these little spires doesn't work. You've got to have a solid mass and a pyramid to show the world that you are the tallest. This is how I read Mallory when he says, this is me paraphrasing Mallory, without a spire at the top, but a broad summit pyramid with mild slopes at that point. Regal as the highest spot on earth should be. Mallory saw the massif as a rocky protrusion with windswept snow, and writes that only the Kangshung face actually has snow overhangs. This is how the Everest massif was first described to the world by Mallory. Quote, Everest is a rugged giant. It has not the smooth undulations of a snowing mountain with white cap and glaciated flanks. And I say, thank God for that, right? It is rather a rock mass, coated often with layer of white powder, which is blown about its sides. It has no spire. Everest is, generally speaking, convex, steep in lower parts and slanting back to the summit. To me, the way to evoke in those days before, easy photography and is through words. And this is what he says. Everest is generally speaking convex, steep in the lower parts, the three arêtes, and the slanting back to the summit. And this, he writes, Everest was not one mountain but two. His reference was to Lhotse. Because for some reason, at some point, and Mallory also changes his views on certain peaks, but perhaps before he went too close and saw the South Col in its depression, he thought that Everest and the South Peak, which is Lhotse, essentially made up one massif. The way today we say Lhotse and Lhotse Shar are the same. This might be what he had thought then. So now, as far as and now I'll come to a series of quotes from Mallory, which are not necessarily part of the 1921 exploration. Then I will speak a bit about the Sherpas and I'll in the expedition. Then I'll conclude my presentation. As far as the term, the line, because it is there, is concerned, it is trite. You could read it as just either a stupid answer or an answer to a stupid question. Or you could say that, is there something missing in it? Indeed, Mallory could be brusque and matter of fact, as when in 1923 he had to respond one more time to a New York Times reporter as to why he sought to climb Everest. Quote, because it is there. But the rest of his answer to the reporter, rarely highlighted, shows that to be more than a throwaway line. Quote, Everest is the highest mountain in the world and no man has reached its summit. Its existence is a challenge. The answer is instinctive. The answer to the question is instinctively a part, I suppose, of man's desire to conquer the universe. And that applies to us till today. Mallory, I might have shared this with you earlier, planned to join the League of Nations. Did I talk about the League of Nations? No. So here is the broad vision of the man. His idea was he would climb as long as he could. He would make a name for himself. Through that name, he would give lectures, he would write books, and he would earn a living for his family. And that is a concern, as you see in the letters exchanged between Ruth and Mallory. Then he planned to work beyond academia, not just teach, but to do something for, if you will, and I'm paraphrasing, world peace. As somebody who had seen battle close up in the trenches of the First World War. So, an admirer of his writes this. Mallory worked out an original scheme for promoting international understanding by a development of geography teaching. Him being a mountaineer, and he seems to have felt maybe there's a via media of teaching geography as a way of inculcating empathy among peoples. So, understanding by a development of promoting international understanding by a development of geography teaching in connection with the work of the League of Nations. The adventure of Mount Everest intervened and he was not a little influenced in his decision to undertake it. Meaning he was influenced in his decision to undertake Mount Everest climb because it involved the sacrifice of his peculiarly happy home life. But by the support of which in this grim field of mountaineering might lead to his crusade. His crusade meaning, by the way, besides taking care of his peculiarly happy family life, lead to his crusade of international understanding of peace and amity. So this to me, this particular facet I discovered only 3 days ago while I was researching this presentation. And that opens a small extra window for me on Mallory. Now let's go. I'll read up with him looking straight at us. I'll quickly read through 3 quotes that are not 3 paragraphs. He was a literary man. So here is how he describes when they were going west from Khampajong, and this was mid-monsoon. So going up from Sikkim, everything was clouded. They saw nothing. When they went up to Tibet, Khampajong going eastward, they went up a hill. I think it was Guy, Bullock and he. They went up a hill to look around to see if they could see Everest. And then suddenly they saw a glint of ice. And then they saw clouds opening up parts of a mountain and closing up again, and as if giving him a great, curtain call, so to speak, an ab initio curtain call where he's sown almost tantalizingly bits and parts until he gets a vision of the whole. And this is what he writes. Therefore, then after that, it opens up completely. And so he writes that evening, Everest was a prodigious white fang, excrescent from the jaws of the world. We were satisfied that the highest of mountains would not disappoint us. Throughout his much closer acquaintance with the high mountain, the awe for Everest never left Mallory, even though he saw much more. He wrote, I sometimes think of this expedition. There were times when he got despondent. He was extremely angry, apparently, at some point, maybe some frustrations during the climb, with Francis' young husband, who went this very route, not towards Everest, but when the British invaded 1903, the British invasion of Tibet, aided by Chandra Samsher, who essentially betrayed Tibet as an historical ally and friend by giving support, logistical and soldiers, to young husband as the British invader of Tibet. It's called the Young Husband Mission, but it should be called the Young Husband Invasion of Tibet. So young husband goes up there, blah, blah, he does everything, but then he goes back and he becomes the chairman of the Mount Everest Committee. Together, and the British Alpine Club is involved, the Royal Geographical Society is involved. Many of the photographs you will see now are from the Royal Geographical Society collection. So, Mallory, livid at young husband, and for which I am not unhappy, says this: I sometimes think of this expedition as a fraud. 1921. I sometimes think of this expedition as a fraud from beginning to end, invented by the wild enthusiasm of one man, young husband, puffed up by the would-be wisdom of certain pundits in the Alpine Club, and imposed upon the youthful ardor of your humble servant. Certainly, this requires reading one more time, right? He says, I sometimes think of this expedition as a fraud from the beginning to end, invented by the wild enthusiasm of one man, young husband, puffed up by the would-be wisdom of certain pundits in the Alpine Club, and imposed upon the youthful ardor of your humble servant. Certainly, the reality must be strangely different from their dream. The long imagined snow slopes of this northern face of Everest, with their gentle and inviting angle, turn out to be the most appalling precipice, nearly 10,000 feet. The prospect of ascent in any direction is about nil, and our present job is to run our noses against the impossible in such a way as to persuade mankind that some noble heroism has failed once again. This is something coming out of his heart, as you can see. And I think young husband back in England did not sleep that night. During the second 1922 expedition, Mallory survived an avalanche below North Col, which took the lives of 7 porters, 7 Sherpas. Before that accident, he had written, frankly, the game is not good enough. So you can see in the next couple of tweets, in the next couple of quotes, tweets were not invented in Mallory's days. So we're where we are today. You'll see that Mallory is ambivalent. He is sometimes energetic and go-to spirit, sometimes rather despondent and defeatist. Frankly, the game is not good enough. The risks of getting caught are too great. The margin of strength when men are at great heights is too small. Perhaps it's mere folly to go up again. But how can I be out of the hunt? And then he writes, he had clandestine, if one might use the word, correspondent with a young lady friend who he had never met. I don't have her name here. But he had never met, but they had kept up a correspondence. So in one of his writings in 1923, as he's planning for the Everest trip, he writes to this lady friend, my chief feeling is we've got to get to the top next time or never. We must get there, and we shall. Here a pause while I imagine myself getting to the top. So that's being also a little coquettish with his friend, imagining himself going to the top. He's written a couple of other instances of getting to the top and how it might feel, how it's actually harder to be on the top than to work to get to the top. I haven't brought those into this presentation here. He writes, I can write but one line. This is when his last posted letter before disappearing into the clouds. You know, he's moving up with Andrew Irvine and Odell, looking from his binoculars, suddenly sees high up 2 figures moving onward. And that is the last visual sighting. The last letter is this, where he writes, I can write but one line. And this is from high up on the mountain. I can write but one line. We are on the point of moving up again, and the adventure appears more desperate than ever. So, the death of the 7 Sherpas must have also been part, this is my understanding, the death of the 7 Sherpas in the earlier expedition of 1922 must also have been part of what impelled Mallory towards the top in 1924 as a kind of redemption for the lives lost. And some might say, oh, but he was a mountaineer and he wouldn't have felt that much for the Sherpas. But my last section here, where I talk about his views on the support staff, porters, Sherpas, will explain to you perhaps he was more sensitive than we give him credit for, or we may give him credit for. Here is the point. I have used the word poignancy more than once. Let me use it one more time here. Besides everything that Everest Mallory saw from the, not from Lola, but from these other pass, because I believe he didn't get to Lola, I would stand corrected, or from the other peaks when they looked down into Nepal. He also had Sherpas with him. And this is why I want to end with talking about the indigenous people, the local inhabitants of East Nepal, of Khumbu, of Upper Khumbu in particular. More touching it is to note that even as they made the arduous trek, I should start here. While the story of Everest exploration from the north is replete with reference to the Sahibs, it was after all the Sherpas who made all these three expeditions possible at all. And it is interesting to chart the evolution of these, what you may call laborers, in the colonial summer retreat of Darjeeling, evolving into the mainstay of high altitude mountaineering. More touching it is to note that even as they made the arduous trek up through Sikkim, across the high plateau, and coming up from Tibet to look down on the Khumbu landscape together with Mallory, Bullock and others, they were looking down at their own homes and valleys. I feel that this is something we need to mull over some more. That Nepal is close to the world, but Nepal's villages are in poverty. The Sherpas from one corner are perhaps more poorer than other parts, even though a lot of them took to trading. So they end up in Darjeeling to do work as the terminology of the day, coolies. They get picked up, their ability, their acumen is seen, and they rise. But they are looking down at their own valleys, valleys that could not sustain them, a nation, a country, a government that would not support them. And they were going away and yet coming back and looking at their own valley from this roundabout way. In his writings, Mallory mostly refers to the Sherpas as coolies as opposed to the Sahibs in uppercase S. Coolies in lowercase c, Sahibs in uppercase S. And only in some places as porters. He was accused of poor judgment and negligence by some in the death of the 7 Sherpas in 1922, particularly Dr. Longstaff of the 1922 expedition. Mallory seemed, however, quite concerned about the care of the supporting climbers and believed that the summit has to be abandoned if it is a choice between that and saving the life of a porter who needs escorting down the mountain. Wrote Mallory, "The obligation is the same whether he be Sahib or Coolie. If we ask a man to carry our load up the mountain, we must care for his welfare and need." Mallory felt deeply his inability to communicate with the Sherpas, having tried to learn the language in Darjeeling and given up other than learning 100 or so words. He wrote of the 1921 expedition, and you can see his humor coming through. Our experiment, meaning the expedition, our experiment was deficient in one, no, this is indeed expedition. Our expedition was deficient in one respect. We were short of words. And so, there must be a way to research the names of the porters of the 3 Everest expeditions in which Mallory was part, including the 7 who died in 1922. Similarly, it would be interesting to know of the Sherpas who christened the mountain Pumori, the exact group, the small group, Tukri if you will, which went up. यहाँ चाहिँ म यति भन्छु कि त्यो जब चाहिँ नि माथि भन्ज्याङमा गएर तल हेर्दाखेरि र त्यो नाम गरेको चाहिँ नि त्यो भन्ज्याङ पुग्नु अगाडि नै हो, यतापट्टि वेस्ट रोङबो ग्लेसियरको कुनै क्षेत्रमा बसेर पुमोरी हेर्दाखेरि त्यो नाम गरे पुमोरी। अब मैले अहिले बुझेसम्म, अनलेस आई एम करेक्टेड, पुमोरी क्लेयर पिकलाई शेर्पाहरूले पुमोरी भने मलाई चासोको विषय अहिले ती शेर्पाहरू को थिए जसले आफू बिचमा गुनगुन गरे अनिखेरि यो त क्लेयर पिक उसको छोरी रहेछ, छोरी भनेपछि छोरी भने फुमो पिक भनेर आफूसँग शेर्पा भाषामा कुरा गर्दै यो गरेको हुनुपर्छ। त्यो भनेदेखि हु वर दे, in particular the name of those in that particular group. And then at one point, similarly it would be interesting to know of the Sherpas who christened the mountain Pumori after Clare Peak. At one point, Mallory refers to Sanglu, the acting Sardar, and Chitang Lexa, we don't understand what it means, as Sardar, Dorji Gompa, probably Dorji Gombu, and Dukpa, who seems to have been the main cook. More than once there is reference to Galjen. I would suspect in the records, and those who have researched more than me would probably know, there must be a name list of all the Sherpas and others who go there. And I would make just one, before reading out my last paragraph, I would make one point talking earlier to Khimlal Gautamji. He referred to how there were others also on the climbs of Everest. And while we speak about the Sherpas, we must also remember there were other ethnicities in the climb, especially from the British Gorkhas, NCOs, non-commissioned officers in Europe, climbing the Alps for the British. Anikari Tamil ekjanaको नाम लिनु भएको थियो नि खिमलालजी हजुर तेजबीर बुढा. His research, much more prodigious than mine, indicates that Tejbir Buddha is referred to again and again as a star, and also the one to reach the highest for what the British will call native. But let me just end now then with this reference. When Everest was called Everest, Sir George Everest was in comfortable retirement, and a gentleman named Waughg, W-A-U-G-H, decided to name it after his former boss of the Great India Trigonometric Survey. There was some opposition to it, particularly from our great historical, what I would call honorary Nepali, Hodgson, Brian Hodgson, who says this peak is actually known to the locals as Dev Dunga, spelled D-O Dunga, D-E-O, saying that Nepalis knew of this because they have traveled to Lhasa. This is on the route, close to the route from Kuti towards Lhasa. They know of it and they call it Devdunga. And the placement is just right. But then the young husband and his clique, if I may, considered the objections of Hodgson and overruled him. And Everest it remains, and Everest it is. Chomolungma, of course, and there was one particular incident where after they finished with west of the mountain, they went over to the east, Kharta, Kama Valley, and they were diverted southward towards Makalu, and they asked the local guide, "Why have you taken us there?" They said, "Well, that's also Chomolungma." So it turns out, according to Mallory, and he uses the word Chomolungma, that some of the locals thought there were two Chomolungmas. And so then they course corrected and came towards the pass that ultimately led them down to the East Rongbuk Glacier, not the regular route from the north, which is coming up the Rongbuk Glacier and taking the East Rongbuk, small gap, and then coming up the North Col, but coming from the east. Kharta, which is essentially a valley that is quite neglected now, but from what I understand, Tenzing Norgay's family comes from Kharta and was working, probably household help, in Thame and Khumbu. So Tenzing Norgay's own history goes to Kharta, from what I understand. So in a way, we come full circle. And I will not now, of course, take you into 1922 and 1924, because my main interest has indeed been the 1921 expedition and the link between Mallory, Everest, Pumori, and of course those of us who live south of the range called the Mahalangur Himal. Perhaps my last paragraph. An example can be seen in the case of Chomolunga itself, overtaken as it has been by Everest and Sagarmatha. Even Devdunga did not make it. On their explorations of the eastern approach from the Kharta Valley, Mallory and his team were led southward towards Makalu rather than Everest, which was the goal. Trying to understand why they were led astray, Mallory writes that the guides seemed to know of two Chomolungmas. Clearly, there were names for the mountains, and so why was there a need for Clare Peak? Why did Mallory feel a need to name the peak Clare Peak? Did the locals not know to tell him? This is a question already maybe an answer in the literature. I do not know. Perhaps the Sherpas in the team did not know the indigenous name for Pumori, if there was one, but that is unlikely, because Pumori is right at the head of the valley. It's more prominent for Khumbu people, even more than Mount Everest, Chomolungma. So it is quite likely that Pumori had its own name, but that it got overtaken by this particular appellation given by a famous mountaineer, carried into the local language by the supporting Sherpas, and then it traveled the world, and maybe the local name went into decline. This is something for our local experts to tell us about. So perhaps the Sherpas in the team did not know the indigenous name for Pumori, if there was one, but that is unlikely. But when they learned about Clare Peak and then decided that it would be Pumori, the name stuck. All one can say for now is that it is a fine name for a beautiful mountain. And one might say the daughter of Chomolungma standing to one side. Thank you. What I would say is, because I've spoken somewhat longer than I planned, if there were anything to be added to or corrected, including the very premise I have that Pumori was transitioning of Clare Peak into Daughter Peak, I would be happy to hear from any of you, or anything else extra that you'd like to share. Huh? Oh, well, this was going to be after, as we are saying goodbye, but I might as well, since there seem to have been no comments, let me just make this. This is Shanta over there, who I am married to, and myself, trailing because I had some altitude sickness, but Shanta was going strong even with a wounded ankle. This is Renjola 2 months ago. Renjola at 17,500 feet or so. And looking back, and it is a telephoto, I'll have to tell you, but what I found incredible in this photograph, of course, is essentially the terrain, for now, for this sake of this presentation, essentially the terrain that Mallory was looking down from his eyrie up in the high pass below Mount Everest. May I ask Reinhold Messner to say a few words and conclude this meeting? I know it's unexpected, but since you happen to be here, and I think the audience would want that.
First of all, congratulations and many thanks. I will not give you a second lecture, I'm not here for this. I only would like to have the quotes about the young husband and the tension between young husband and mother.
Yes, I'll send it to you.
Because I read them, I knew that they had not a good relationship, but anyway, young husband was the motor of these 3 Everest expeditions. And what happened exactly in 1903, 1904, we know, but in this expedition he went to Lhasa, he went to the Dalai Lama, and he got the permit for the English to cross Tibet to reach Mount Everest. Without this permit they could not either approach the mountain, and this is exactly history on the back side. Maybe I was not lucky enough to find it.
I'll send it to you. I'll give it to you.
In a copy, I would be very, very happy.
Your book, The Second Death of Mallory, you could just tell us, I didn't refer to it in my presentation, but why you felt the need to write that book, and then that would add to our understanding.
I had my first contact with Mallory in detail in 80 when I climbed the north side of Mount Everest. I crossed below the summit ridge, knowing that the summit ridge would be quite difficult, and there was many snow between my line and the Mallory line, and I could not touch the Mallory line in the upper part. But having spoken with Odell by myself, I was very happy about it. Having seen the Shin, I know, there's no doubt, Mallory and Irvine did not go to the summit. The second step in 1924 was not possible for nobody. And in reality, the Chinese, when they climb up to this second step in 60, they didn't go higher. They found out there is no way for normal climbers with the equipment they had. And so they went back, and in the next expedition they took up the ladders. And with the ladders, one ladder above the other, they were able to overcome the second step. Because this was not by fair mean climbing, this was technical climbing. But in 24, Mallory and Urban did not have any help and not any equipment for overcoming the second step. Odell also told me that you could not say if he has seen Mallory and Urban climbing in move on the second step or maybe on the first step. But describing to me, the whole night we were together in London, describing to me how he had seen these two figures. He has seen one figure on the edge, on a flat edge, and the next one on a steep step. And the next one went up in 3 minutes on the second step. He was thinking, now the best climbers of the world, they need 20 minutes, 30 minutes to do the second step with totally different equipment. We have almost to think about the equipment they had if we speak about historical facts. I also think that Mallory was on the Lola and could look down to the Khumbu ice falls. I cannot prove it, but I think in his letters and in his big article he wrote afterwards, he's telling with somebody else in product, they could see down the ice fall, the Khumbu ice fall, and they decided there's no way up. And so they stuck on the north side, and they find also the right way of Mallory to find the right way up to the North Coast. But my experience about Mallory's second test, when I heard that an expedition led by, I don't know, by an American, I think, found the body, I was very enthusiastic, knowing how the body is lying there, what is the equipment he has. If he would have special rock climbing boots on his feet. So the chances from impossible second step to maybe possible would be given. But when I have seen later on the photos with the shoes and with the nails,
hobnailed boots.
Yeah, very perfect shoes for the climb, but not for the second step. I knew he did not go to the summit. And I was just working then on the beginning of my idea to build up a museum on mountaineering, on mountains, on relationship between mountains and human beings. And I got 2 weeks later fax or some information from somewhere asking if we would help them write a book about Mallory up to 1999 when they found him. And I answered, okay, I will help you. I will be at your disposal. I don't ask any money for writing, for helping, but I would like to get the shoe from our museum. And they answered, but they did not really give an answer. And we had 3 letters passing by, and never I find out that they say, okay, you get the shoe and you help us. And after the 3rd letter, I decided I do my book. I did it in 2 weeks.
Wow.
And I invented the trick, it's a trick, a little trick, that I unbroke Mallory, let him sit there for 75 years, and overview what's happening. And so the key sentence is very simple. When Hillary and Tenzing reaches the summit, he's there and he sees them. And he's saying, Hillary is first, no doubt. So he says, I was not on the summit.
Yeah.
But I am the miss because I disappeared. And it's much stronger disappearing than conquering mountains.
Just one last question, Mr. Messner. Would Mallory have been happy, in your view, because you've intensely looked into his personality, the way Himalayan mountaineering has gone, of which you are a critic, what would Mallory say?
I think that Mallory today, if he would still be alive, he would only shake his head.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. The boots.
The boots are gone to America. I don't know who has them. They are not in the public.
Conrad Anchor.
But he did not take the Conrad Anchor found.
Yeah, he didn't.
It's also very interesting that Conrad Anchor found the body in a place where nobody was thinking the body is, because Hamlet, who was there as a historian, has not the slightest idea about Mallory, about the whole history. And he decided that this is the place to look for. And when Anchor, I know him very well, went right side, he on the phone from the base camp said, no, go back, this is too dangerous, there is no body. And there he found the body. And there's no doubt that they failed, but why, you don't know. Probably in the night or maybe in the mist, it was misty, it was windy, it was high up. Do not hope for, that's a great sentence, erwartet keine Gnade vom Everest, in English. Erwartet keine Gnade, was heißt Gnade? Do not expect some, nobody speak German here? Gnade.
Is this Mallory or Anchor?
No, that's Mallory.
Mallory, yeah.
Do not expect any mercy.
I've got it in here. Read my article.
I don't expect Gnade from Everest.
It's got it. It's
So
a
it's
quote.
a very hard thing, and he was bad. But only in the way he approached it. Not approaching
Jerry?
it exactly.
Huh?
We got information today that on none of them they go
Oh, yeah.
the climbers
Sherpa
go
picture.
from Camp
Sherpa
One.
picture,
Now from
Sherpas.
base camp to Camp 2 in helicopters. They don't climb anymore. Half of the way they do in helicopters. 38 times the helicopter flew people down the winter base camp to Camp 2. Got information today.
Thank you. Yeah.
It's not anymore mountaineering, this is tourism.
Tourism. Since we brought Reinhold back to the mic twice, I'm coming back to the mic once. There's something I forgot to share with you. The Sherpas. This was supposed to be my slides to go with the photographs. These are pictures by Mallory. And after having said all I did about the Sherpas, let us look at this. You long shot, oh? Long shot. In this, you'll notice the faces. You'll see that how rudimentary is the equipment, and they actually don't even have, certainly no carabiners, no other equipment, but ropes tied around their midriff. And if you go to the close-up, yes. So when we are talking about who were these Sherpas, we have close-ups of at least 3 of them, and there will be many more pictures of other Sherpas by other climbers. But there are 3 or 4 things I wanted to mention here. One is the clothing. The other is the one on the rightmost, has a box, and that may carry the camera. But if you see, he's wearing our regular Daura Sural. So he's wearing a Daura Sural high up on the mountain. I just leave you with this image as a tribute to the Sherpas and the other mountain climbers of other ethnicities from then till now. Thank you all. Didi, come on. Hajar?
Thank you, Kanak sir, for your nice presentation about the Mallory and Pumori. Pumoriलाई डटर पिक भनेर ब्राकेटमा राख्नु भएको छ, तर त्यसभन्दा अगाडि कसरी उहाँले डटर पिक भन्नुभयो भन्ने कुरा चाहिँ विस्तृत रूपमा मलाई थाहा थिएन। त्यो एउटा चाहिँ लेटरको बारेमा चाहिँ नि अहिले कनक सरले भन्नुभयो, त्यसपछि मात्र मलाई थाहा भयो। नि उहाँले कसरी लेख्नुभयो डटर पिक त्यो थाहा थिएन, आई डोन्ट नो।
In 1923, George Mallory himself wrote an article on a journal, and in this article he has mentioned Mount Pumori as a daughter mountain, and I was not aware why he used the word Total Mountain, but I just came to know about this one when connoisseur elaborated about his presentation.
सन् 1921 मा पहिलोचोटि माउन्ट एभरेस्ट रिकनेन्सिस एक्सपिडिसन पनि भनिन्छ। त्यो एक्सपिडिसनमा चाहिँ नि त्यहाँ केही चाहिँ नेपालीहरू पनि थिए। त्यसमा लालबीर सिंह थापा भन्ने एकजना सर्वेयर रेड सर्वे अफ इन्डियामा काम गर्नुहुन्थ्यो। लालबीर सिंह थापा भन्ने यहाँबाट चाहिँ देहरादुनमा माइग्रेट भएका थापा गालीका छोरा थिए। त्यसको बारेमा मेरो किताबमा केही कुराहरू आउँछ। तर त्यो लालबीर सिंह थापा लगायतको त्यसमा चाहिँ मुख्यतः चाहिँ क्यानाडियन सर्वेयर व्हिलर भन्ने सर्वेयर त्यसको चाहिँ सर्वेइङ एक्सपिडिसनको टिममा थिए। त्यसमा मेलरीहरू पनि सगेको थिए। सीके बुआर हवे भन्ने चाहिँ उहाँ टिम लिडर हुनुहुन्थ्यो। उहाँ रिटायर्ड ब्रिगेडियर जनरल अफ द ब्रिटिस आर्मी। उहाँको टिम लिडरमा गएको थियो 1921 मा। त्यो कुरा भन्न छुट्यो जस्तो लाग्छ। र त्यसमा चाहिँ के छ भने त्यो द expedition was not only the climbing Mount Everest, but that expedition was the aim of that expedition was also the research and the prepare of the detailed topographical map of the Kharta Valley, not only the Kharta Valley, but also the Kama Valley and the Rangu Glacier.
One Nepali was also in his team. His name is Lalavir Singh Thapa. Actually, he was migrated to India and was working for the Indian forces at that time.
And उहाँले चाहिँ कनक सरले भने जस्तै उहाँ चाहिँ जर्ज मेलोरी त्यो चाहिँ जुलाईको 23 तारिखबाट अगस्तको 8 तारिख भित्रमा चाहिँ उहाँहरूले चाहिँ त्यहाँ जानु भएको छ। ठ्याक्कै डेट चाहिँ कुनै पनि अल्बाइट जर्नल एकाडेमिक जर्नलले that was not proved that on which date he saw the Pumori for the first time.
Its conductor mentioned George Mallory and his team started the expedition starting from July 23rd to August 8th, but this has not been mentioned specifically in any documents.
मेरो research अनुसार, as per my research and studies, Mallory, George Paynes, he was a geologist on that expedition team, and Bullock and Morsi, the 4 people goes together just above the Lola Peak. Where Lola Peak ko माथि जानु भएको.
As per my research, the 4 people, there were some geographer and other people, and they just reached above the Lola Peak.
And Lola Peak बाट उहाँले चाहिँ पुमरी पनि देख्नु भयो, वेस्ट कुम पनि देख्नु भयो. वेस्ट कुम भनेको अब हिउँको फाँट पनि भन्न सकिन्छ नेपालीमा. जस्तो पिस्कुन जस्तो पनि भन्न सकिन्छ. विभिन्न अर्थ लाग्छ. त्यसको लिङ्ग्विस्टिक मिनिङहरु धेरै होला. म लिङ्ग्विस्टिक एक्सपर्ट चाहिँ होइन. यो सर्वे
These are the Lola Peak and the mountain massif from that area. Yeah.
West कुमको. त्यो पश्चिमतर्फ फैलिएको फाँट भएको कारणले लुकेको फाँट भएला त्यहाँ भनेको देखिन्छ. र वास्तवमा यो प्रेजेन्टेसन अत्यन्त राम्रो, अत्यन्त चाहिँ ज्ञानवर्धक, मैले धेरै कुरा सिक्ने मौका पाएँ. र त्यो नक्साहरू चाहिँ एउटा चाहिँ त्यो चोमलङको एउटा नक्सा चाहिँ कनक सरले देखाउनु भएको थियो. त्यो चाहिँ रोयल जियोग्राफिक सोसाइटीले 1922 मा बनाएको नक्सा हो. त्यो चाहिँ इन्डियामा नै तयार गरिएको हो. र त्यो नक्सा चाहिँ that was not mentioned the peak Chomolungma, as we call the Mount Everest top. In that map, they mentioned the group of Chomolungma. Chomolungma is not only a peak. Chomolungma is the group of mountains, name of the group of mountains, as per my research.
Presentation was so nice, and the map shown in the presentation was produced by the Royal Geographic Society in 1922.
Anyway, thank you for sharing, thank you for giving me opportunity to share my some knowledge in Nepali language. Thank you all.
Tasdili Namaste, I'm Fasan Sherpa from Khumbu, and it was great pleasure that we made Kanak and Santa Mem in Bukyo, and when they are on the top of Rendezvous, I was very happy. So we share about the mountain and how to develop mountain. We share one night, we talk something. So I think right now we are talking about Pumori. So at the time, I think normally when I was talking with the Western people, I always say that, because when I was making my Sherpa climbers book, I talked with lots of elder Sherpa people, and they give the lots of Sherpa feelings talk with me. So at the time, what I learned is like, I would like to say Everest and Sagarmatha is just a nickname of that mountain. The original name is Jomo Meo Longsoma. So Jomo Meo Longsoma, so it's come Jomolongma. So Jomo Meo Longsoma is written on the book. So we have some, Ganaksa is like, we have some doubt that Mallory's daughter name, or we have some confused, right? So I think as all our mountains have our own Sherpa name, like Tamserku, Kangteka, Chomoloma, Amadablam and all. So the Pumori should be the shepherd name first. So maybe Mallory will ask like that, what is the meaning of Pumori? So maybe someone said, Pumori. So Pum means daughter, Wori means our daughter. So we respect as our ancient respect as that mountain as our daughter. So that Mallory thought that, oh, so let's give my daughter's name. So maybe I think that is. Thank you.
Let me say thank you very, very much, Kanak. That was really, really good. Thank you for telling us all about Mallory and his tribulations as well as about Pumori. And now we heard something else about Pumori. So this is another thing that we learned. And today it's been a day of learning. And I think for me it's been a great day of learning more things. So I hope everybody has enjoyed it. And especially I think today, after all this talk about the centennial, we have to always do things in the century. We haven't done that, so this is something that we should keep up. And I'm very happy that Kanak came and said that let's do it before 21 ends, because it is the end of the century. So I think this is what we've done, and I hope we keep that up as a century of Mallory. So now, today, of course, as a bonus, we have here another mountaineer who's done so much. He's climbed so many things and written so many books. So it's really an honor and a pleasure to have you here, Arun River. So thank you for being here, and thank you for being in Nepal, and thank you for coming and taking me this little request that you come here. Thank you, and for giving us your feelings about Mallory and what you thought and what you've written about. So thank you very, very much. And please enjoy your stay here. And to all the others who've been here, I hope you have felt that this was something that we learn about our own mountains, all of our Nepalis, with what we have and what we do not really appreciate. I think we Nepalis, I don't know I should say it or not, but we always say, oh, Nepal, we're a poor country. Shame on you, I say. We are not a poor country. As you see all this, we are not poor. See the Nepali people here, see what we have. See what we are having within us. And look at the people who have done it. Look at the Sherpas and look at just now, look at what he has done. Who can sit up there on the top of the mountain for 2 hours where you can't even breathe? Look, there we have a hero here among us. Do we understand that our people are the strength, and they are the ones, the heroes, and nobody has done it. And I'm very happy that the 14 peaks, what is his name, Nims Buddha, he showed us what the Nepalis can do. So I think we should be proud and work hard like this, as he has done, and we should recognize them. Who has been ever talking about him? And I would really like to say that we should recognize you. Sorry? Huh? Gautam. Yeah, Gautam. Yeah, I just want to say him, that's why I just pointed at him. Gautam. He is, no, we should recognize him and see what he has done. And among you here, I see people who are doing so many great things. I'm watching here. I see a professor here who's been working on Tony Hagen's book. and all this. So thank you so much for being here on this cold day. It's been cold, but I think the talk has warmed all your hearts, and you will take back some warm feelings. And thank you for being here. And a very, very good, healthy, happy, and successful 2022 to all of you. Thank you. And thank you so much for all the effort and the work that you have done. Thank you.
Thank you.